I think it's important that people know that approximately 60% of Vancouverites are in fact renters. The majority of people in this city rent. So it's very important that when we're thinking about housing, we're thinking about a continuum and a diversity of housing types to ensure that everyone has a place to live so that we have a diverse and healthy city. Of those 60% renters, the majority of them are living in housing that's unaffordable. Vancouver consistently has among the highest rents and the lowest vacancy rates in the country. So this means that it's a pretty tough place for renters to live. Half of all renters are paying more than 30% of their income on rent, and 30% is the benchmark. If you pay more than that, then your housing is considered unaffordable. And 1/4 pay more than 50% of their income on rent. And this is just staggering when you think of how much money is left over to pay for food and transportation and all the other necessities of life. Affordable housing is getting worse. BC Housing's overall wait list is just under 10,000 households right now. I don't know how many of those are in Vancouver, probably a very large number of them. Homeless on the street.
In total, how many units would you say BC Housing is doing a year?
Well, since June of 2001, we have committed funding for about 3,400 units, so that's more than 1,000 units a year.
Do you have a waiting list for people that need housing?
Yes, BC Housing operates a housing registry. There are currently about 10,000 households on our wait list for housing across the province.
You froze a social housing court, and so you frozen me.
But the other point to make is that government is not going to meet all of the housing needs of everyone in the province. It really requires.
Why not?
It really requires a strong role for the private market and government to focus its resources on those most in need. Government can't spend enough money to satisfy all of the need.
Because it doesn't have the money?
Part of the strategy has to be to work with the private sector. The private sector provides 95% of the housing in British Columbia. That market needs to continue to operate as efficiently as it can. And that's why there's a focus on taxation and deregulation so that the private sector can help meet more and most of the need in British Columbia, and then the government focuses its resources on those most in need, like the project with the Union Gospel Mission, like the project with the Dr. Peter AIDS Foundation.
So there's a lack of about 8,000 people that perhaps cannot go to the private market because they don't have the funds. So don't you think that the government should come up with maybe more housing?
There are scarce resources that government has to allocate, and those decisions have been made to help those that are most vulnerable, and then really focus on the market and making the market be able to work more efficiently to provide opportunities, housing opportunities across the province.
All right. Okay, so I'm going to start with the basic need around shelter and show how approach to land reform, known as community land trusts, helps us reclaim the commons, democratize ownership, and reweave solidarity into the heart of how we think about property rights. Okay, so here's where we were, 1980, 3.5 years of work by a carpenter, and that's what a house was worth. Today, the average price in Canada is $370,000 for a heist. A house. I know that seems cheap here. It's even cheaper. I mean, it seems even cheaper in Vancouver. But that's 8 years of a carpenter's wages today. Okay, so there's been a bit of a change. So now, not far from where I am right now, the year I was born, it was set at that 3.5 years for a carpenter's wages. All right? But that same house, and I've gone to look at this house, that's what it's worth today. That's 33 years of carpenter's wages. That's, folks, what you call the cost price squeeze. And not only that, we've got bigger and bigger houses. In fact, if you put another one here today, we'd be up around 2,400 square feet. And people would be bitching about sometimes that's not just enough room for 5 people, right? I mean, anyway. The other thing, of course, the households are getting smaller. So there you had 3.9 people living in that small house. Now there's 2.6 living in that big house, right? Well, and you know, it's interesting because we have become much more efficient in terms of our energy use at the residential level, but guess what? Even though we've become more and more efficient, our overall use at the residential level has gone up 14%. So, you know, we've got a few contradictions here, culturally embedded contradictions in terms of how we're caught up in this web. So we basically canceled that all out. So here, there's some key affordability factors. So obviously, bigger houses, more capital, higher operating costs, financing. We'll return to that very briefly later. Compound interest, I call it the invisible bars of the debt prison, is a very, very dramatic impact and has a very big dramatic on whether or not we can turn the corner we were talking about earlier. And the speculative logic of private property.
You're on the Broderick, and what is your title with Vancity?
I'm Vice President for Community, Vice President Community Investment.
Community investment. Now, how has Vancity contributed to affordable housing?
Well, again, Vancity's got a long history of contributing to affordable housing. Again, I don't know if you know, but our founding was based on the frustration of some families from the east side of Vancouver who couldn't get home loans, and they couldn't get the big banks to lend on the east side of Main Street. So they started Vancity to through collaboration and forming a cooperative to put their money together and set up an institution that could lend in areas that essentially had been redlined by other lenders. So starting with that, I know that's not the answer you're necessarily looking for, but we're doing a lot these days based on sort of living up to our historic roots to try and help our members and their communities thrive and be strong. And we think that's only possible if there's affordable, safe, decent, and affordable housing for not only our members, but their neighbors.
Yeah, so it makes it a little easier for borrowers to borrow some money from Vancity that would be from a private bank. However, the interest rate is the same as a private bank, isn't it?
Yeah, the interest rates will be close. Sometimes we have a bunch of different programs. Let me sort of back up a second. We do commercial loans to developers and to nonprofit partners who are trying to develop multifamily housing or condominiums. We also do mortgage products for individual buyers. We have a particular product aimed at first-time home buyers who have worked closely with some of our nonprofit partners. It's called the Springboard Mortgage, which has a way to help first-time buyers get the down payment by having a second loan, a personal loan for that down payment, which essentially is deferred for the first 10 years and then gets repaid as part of their loan. So we do a lot of work, with our conventional tools, trying to modify them. But I'd also say probably our most important work, and from my perspective, and my background, as you'll hear, is affordable housing development.
So we're a registered nonprofit charitable organization that's been in existence since 1988, and we provide a range of affordable housing options, right from supported housing up until low end of market housing. And we focus on families, people with physical and developmental disabilities, and some senior housing, and then a supported housing for individuals that have been facing homelessness. So a wide range of affordable housing options.
And how is it funded?
We're funded through a variety of means. So tenants pay a tenant rent contribution. And then BC Housing is our primary funder. We additionally get some housing for our support services and our housing outreach through the Health Authority and private donors.
So the Health Authority, again, is the government. What is the percentage of the tenants' contribution compared to the government?
So the tenant contribution, because the housing is for most need is around core need, is that people not pay more than 30% of their income. So their rent contribution would be 30% of their income, and then the balance would come through a variety of different funders, whether it's government, which is our largest funder.
That 30% is the person's income, but the budget of Pacifica Housing is what percentage?
I would say about 75% of our funding comes from government, and then the balance of it would be through other means.
Is it been decreasing or increasing, or has been the same for the past 10 years or so, the contribution from the government? The contributions have been fairly static. The formulas that our funding is based on, there are some areas such as non-manageable costs, things to do with utilities, property taxes, mortgage payments, where we don't have a lot of options around managing the money. Those we get increases for based on the amounts that annually occur, and then there's other manageable costs around staffing, some of the work, maintenance work, and that we do that is manageable. So we need to be very cognizant of where our dollars are going and how to manage it in order to meet our budget. Is the viability of social housing very much impaired with the type of government we have, say, decides to completely cut or reduce drastically the amount of contribution subsidy? Would that affect Pacifica Housing?
Any time that there's drastic cuts, it can have an impact when you're dependent on government funding, although we enter into fairly long-term agreements with our funders. So some of our agreements are 50, 60 years or 30 years. So there is some sense of stability, and certainly where it becomes more of an issue is around creating new housing. So there aren't a lot of opportunities as the fiscal dollars in government get tighter. There aren't a lot of opportunities around developing new housing because there isn't the money for those programs. And I think that one particular area that that the provinces across right across Canada are facing is the lack of commitment from the federal government around a real commitment towards housing and ensuring that there is safe, adequate, and affordable housing for the residents and of our country. And housing is a core, and Pacifica really sees that our focus is on housing first, that it is a basic need, a core need that people require in order to be able to address any of the other issues that they have in their life. So it's essential that people have housing.
We also work with these community partners, whether it's Habitat for Humanity of Greater Vancouver, CHFBC, the Co-op Housing Federation of BC, Success. We have a number of partners who we will make investments in to increase the level of affordability in the housing they have. And these investments are, I guess the best way to put it is they're charitable investments. In other words, they're not loans, and we're not expecting them to be repaid as long as the housing remains affordable.
Mm-hmm. What do you mean that you're not expecting to be repaid? You mean you're not...
On these particular investments would be, for instance, we gave Habitat when it was faced with, it was, I think provided, my numbers maybe not be absolutely perfect, but it was working in our project on, what's this street, Cordova, the East Cordova project, which we did in the downtown east side. Habitat, I believe, bought 10 of those condominium units. We provided I think it was a $40,000 a unit grant that was put into each property to reduce the purchase price for the buyers. Now, as long as Habitat doesn't doesn't sort of flip that to the market, as long as they keep that 40,000 as a sort of a second mortgage, which doesn't have to get repaid, we don't expect to be repaid. If Habitat ever sort of changes its mission or decides it wants to sell those on the market to fund something else, they have to get our permission.
Or pay it back.
Or pay it back, yeah.
All right. All right. So you do a lot of similar student grants and loans. The government gives a little bit of a grant and a little bit of a loan. So Vancity is doing a little bit of that social financial work.
Yeah, we are, but we're doing it with our partners. So it tends to be driven by, I'm a real firm believer in community-controlled assets. In other words, that the local nonprofit groups, particularly the ones that are the strongest, that have the strongest boards and show the most sophistication, that we should figure out how to support them in their mission. And so I'm more apt to sort of put those resources, that charitable funds, those investments, under their control and have them figure out the right tool to or the right product to serve their mission and their neighbors.
The issue of availability of social housing. Do you think that we have enough social housing for the needy in big cities like Vancouver and Victoria? Or do you think that there's shortage of it?
Well, we know there's a shortage of it. In the capital region here last year, there were over 1,500 people on a housing registry, which many of the nonprofit housing sectors use to select our tenants from. And so that's a good number. 86% of those were families, seniors, and people with disabilities. And then we also know from some of the work that the Greater Victoria Coalition on to End Homelessness has been working on, that there were over 1,600 people that were unique users in shelters last year. So they visited a shelter at least once. So there's a great need, and the need goes across the country. So I think that particularly in the last few years, BC has been fairly fortunate in the number of new units that has been able to add to the mix, but there is a shortfall. And one statistic I was looking at recently was that 1/3 of the renters are in core needs or paying more than 30% of their income, and 1/5 of homeowners are. So we need housing right across the continuum, right from shelters up to affordable home ownership.
When you say the government of BC subsidizes Pacifica, that means BC Housing.
That's correct, housing. We also have contracts because Pacifica is unique in that we not only provide housing, we have a portfolio of over 800 units, but we also provide outreach services. So we have housing outreach workers that assist people in need to find appropriate housing, whether it's in the market or whether it's in a nonprofit housing setting. And we also are funded for a rent supplement program in the private marketplace, because affordability, particularly in cities like Vancouver, Victoria, and with our vacancy rates, it makes it very difficult for people.
And we're working with CHFBC, the Co-op Housing Federation of BC, in a response to the city of Vancouver for 4 new sites. It'll be over 500 units of housing, and we're putting a significant amount of grant money in that, but we're also trying to put a lot of mortgage money, and really impressed by the partners who've been brought together around that deal.
Who are those partners?
Partners are that's a very good question. I may have to do some follow-up with you. It's Terra Housing. It's the CHFBC Land Trust. It's I'm going to remember the principals' names. Tika, which is housing. I think I'll send you a list of the 5 partners. Let me make a list of things.
No, I was just trying to differentiate between investors, partners,
no, these
developers, or you're talking of developing agencies that basically plan and help the development itself.
Yeah, they're getting very, very sophisticated in how to take, say, a free. In this case, it would essentially be a free piece of land from the city of Vancouver, and through, now there's a big subsidy, you know, and get that as far as they can get it in terms of creating a whole spectrum of affordability for different groups they're trying to serve, from sort of very, very low income residents, which traditional social housing, I guess you'd say, to sort of more just below market rental housing, and a whole bunch of stuff in between.
Mm. The below market would be 30% of the individual's income. That would be
the social housing. Yes, the number of the housing that's needed, or a fair amount that's needed, does not necessarily have to be tied to income. I mean, some needs to be, because people have very low incomes and they can't afford it. And obviously, in designing a project, a rental project, you design it for the target rent so that it will be 30% of somebody's income, and you make sure as a nonprofit that it stays there. But probably not in all your projects will you have the rent sort of going up and down as the residents change. You'll make sure you bring residents in that are in the same income group.
Mm-hmm, mm-hmm. So what is needed to increase that number of units? If you said we are short of social housing units, what, in your opinion, is needed to increase it?
Well, I think a commitment from all levels of government. You know, so we have seen that the federal government over the last, you know, a couple of decades has really withdrawn themselves from funding housing. And so I think having a commitment and even an affordable housing strategy, you know, and commitment from the federal level, and then through the provinces and down in where municipalities now are facing, you know, contributing towards housing, because it's a serious issue for the constituents that live in any, you know, municipality or city. And it hasn't, you know, traditionally it wasn't municipal, you know, at the municipal level, but we need all three levels of government to be involved.
Yeah. Some cities have land that can contribute towards social housing.
Yes.
Do you know if here in Victoria there's some land available that could be developed social housing?
Well, there was an initiative between the provincial government and municipal governments where the province went out and said to the various municipal governments and saying, if you have land, you know, let's work in partnership. And it was a provincial homelessness initiative. So Pacifica was fortunate that we were successful, and we operate and manage one of those sites, which is our Camas Garden site. And it's at 950 Humboldt Street. And it's a supported housing for 44 individuals. So some of those have been created where there were opportunities where municipalities came forward and said, we have land, and we have you know, we have availability that we can work with the province, and the province is providing the capital funding and very favorable interest rates, and so the numbers work. We're able to create it. And Pacifica as well is working on a similar project in Nanaimo, where the city of Nanaimo had a piece of land that was available. So Pacifica will hold a lease on that land, and BC Housing and the city of Nanaimo and Pacifica are working together to create some supportive housing on that site.
Mm-hmm. So Pacifica does the developing of the building, the units, and the management and operations of the housing complex.
That's correct. That's correct. And then we're you know, each of the other partners, the municipalities and the province, are, you know, contributing from a financial perspective.
Mm-hmm. Now, CHF. The cooperative housing of BC and the cooperative housing of Canada, they used to have a lot of loans from CMHC. Are they still working through CMHC, or they're replacing that by Vancity?
I think they're doing they're being entrepreneurial. Let's put it that way. I think. In other words, they're doing a lot of loans. I think they're going to be doing a lot of loans with us. There's a big part of that portfolio of co-op housing is coming to the end of its CMHC mortgages, and the CMHC has not stepped forward yet with a product that would provide ongoing subsidy. If CMHC does, I fully expect that CHFBC and others should try and take advantage of that. It will probably not be something that covers the whole portfolio, so there'll definitely be room for Vancity and other financial institutions and cooperatives to step in.
What would you say to the politicians that run in BC that they should have some commitment? What kind of commitment would it be to alleviate the affordability of housing?
Well, I think recognizing and that housing is a key component for each community. That is how important that having housing for our citizens is, and being able to work with communities and having the housing and housing affordability being a priority, and be working to lobby, a commitment to work to lobby on a federal level as well. So, it's important for the local politicians running in the provincial election to really understand the issue and what can be done. It is much less expensive to support people in housing than it is through shelters or living on the street.
Mm-hmm. They might say, yes, we do understand the issue and we'll do our best.
Yeah.
Is that good enough?
Well, no, it's never good enough. And of course, like all sectors, and I know health is always asking for more money and housing. I think that, our perspective is because, all the issues are important, but housing is a core need. And you can't really always address people's health issues unless they have a place that they can call home and that they can go and address what their health issues are.
When you talk about cooperative housing, many of these neighborhoods were developed, 30 or 40 years ago. The density that they were developed to was less than is currently allowed. There's certainly challenges around the physical structure and its condition, but there's also opportunity around being able to densify and mix the incomes and sort of, serve everybody who lives there and keep their homes stable and get them, back onto a sort of a fully renovated, first-class condition housing. And at the same time, through smart use of the resource that's there, try and build a subsidy pool that can help them manage that for another 30 or 40 years and still serve the same income groups.
You're saying that the same co-ops that were formed 20 or 30 years ago could enlarge by adding some more units in the same piece of real estate?
Yes. Yeah, no, they absolutely could. Some of them, some can't. Some are going to be tougher than others, but, you just sort of got to roll up your sleeves and sort of start, with strong partners like CHFBC. There's a new development company that's been started, a nonprofit development company that's owned by CHFBC, known as a social purpose development, SPD.
Is it in Vancouver?
It is in Vancouver. It's going to also serve Victoria, though. And actually, I'm coming over next Thursday with the new acting CEO of that to meet with some people in Victoria. But the idea is to sort of recognize what developers recognize is that each situation has an opportunity. You have to be smart about it. You can't create something out of nothing, obviously, but there is a lot of resources there. Those are great communities. Those co-op communities. They've built a fabric of relationships and a management capacity, and they've sort of leveraged all this volunteer labor and love, I think, to some degree. And there's a great deal of opportunity to use that and use the real estate resources they control to make sure that goes on into the future.